Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As we announced yesterday, we are privileged to have with us now for this hour Josh McDowell, certainly no stranger to our listening audience, an individual that has spoken to more than 25 million people, 148 books in 128 different languages, more than a carpenter, 27 million copies distributed, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, of course, one of the most significant books in the area of apologetics. And we're going to be talking about this new book, Set Free to Choose Right, Equipping Today's Kids to Make Right Moral Choices for Life. Josh McDowell's been in ministry for more than 50 years. Josh, it is always a privilege to have you on Point of View. And I guess we'll have to see if we can get him on there in just a minute. We will do what we can to get Josh. In the meantime, let me just mention that this is a book that I think you will find very helpful, because it really helps make some of the decisions to begin to deal with ethics. Josh, how are you doing now?
I am doing incredible, just better since talking with you.
You're so sweet. All right, we
go back many years together, my brother, and many interviews.
I was just thinking about that. You know, I first met you when I was vice president of the student body and introduced you at an event. But you know, when you said 50 years of ministry, I started adding it up. I was going, I guess I'm at 42 years, so I'm just behind you here. So we certainly have been doing a lot of interviews over the years, and let me just commend to our listeners, even though we're going to focus on this book, Set Free to Choose Right, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the latest version, so helpful. And just the other day when I had your son on, we, of course, talked about the fate of the apostles. And at the end, he said, you know, if you don't want to spend the money for that really expensive book, which I did, he said, we have a summary of that in your latest chapter in Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So even if you have the old version, you need to get the new version, because it's got so much new material in it that I have really appreciated.
You know, it's probably the most revised book ever, 70% new.
So again, I would highly commend it to all of you. Let's get into your book, Set Free to Choose Right. You kind of tell us the story of the Jeffries family. You've got Aubrey and Jaden and Bradley, but it really gets us almost immediately into something else we've talked about with you, and that is the issue of pornography, the threat of our young people to make wise choices in a sex-saturated culture. So tell us a little bit more about the structure of the book.
Well, I wanted to write the book because I realized that the overwhelming majority of young people I meet, Christian young people in churches, they know right from wrong, but they have no idea in their mind why it's wrong. And as a result, they don't know how to make right choices. Parents are not passing it on to their children. And if you know right from wrong, that's a belief system. If you know why things are right, why things are wrong, that's a conviction. And I'll tell you this, Kerby, in the day of the internet and pornography, no child will survive, I don't care how good the Christian beliefs are, without convictions. Because it'll undermine everything they believe.
Well, and again, part of the challenge is that it used to be fairly difficult to run into problems. You had to go to that section of town to find material about pornography. You had to go and run with the bad crowd in order to maybe get yourself in trouble. Now, because of the internet, it is sometimes just a mouse click away whether it's an affair, whether it's gambling, whether it's pornography, whether it's hooking up with someone or being bullied by other individuals. So the internet, although it has some tremendous benefits, has some really dark back alleys, and that's all the more reason why we need to educate our young people to make wise choices and to do it with conviction.
The internet, as you well know, Kerby, has absolutely changed everything. Everything. There's nothing in life that has not been affected by the internet, from our faith in Christ to, as you said, moral issues and the access of literature, pictures, photographs, pornography, whatever, has all been changed. And the problem is, because of that, we've got to change our parenting approach. One, if we do not develop a loving, intimate relationship with our child, I don't care what you teach them about right from wrong, pornography, whatever, they're not going to follow it usually. Because rules without relationships lead to rebellion. Second, if we do not clearly teach our children, not just what is right and what is wrong, but why is it right, why is it wrong? For example, in the last 15 to 18 years, I probably asked 400 people, pastors, others, you believe lying is wrong? Yes. Why? I cannot recall one person who gave an intelligent, biblically based answer in 15 to 18 years. And that is preparation for failure with our children. Because as parents, if we don't understand it, you are not going to pass it on to your children.
So again, just a good illustration of why we need to work on it first with ourselves. And for people that want to know the why, that's an important part, because it's kind of like you've been known for dealing with apologetics, how to defend the Christian faith. In this case, it's sort of how to defend why we have moral rules in the first place. So where would you direct individuals through this book to begin to understand that in their own life so they can then pass it on biblically to their kids?
Well, the book basically is why are things right and why are things wrong? And then how do you pass it on to your children? So one, why is lying wrong? Almost every single pastor, parent, Christian leader, student, adults will say, because the Bible says, thou shalt not lie. And I'll go, that's ridiculous. To say that lying is wrong because the Bible says, thou shalt not lie. The Bible, put it this way, is lying wrong because the Bible says, thou shalt not lie, which 99% of Christians say yes, or does the Bible say thou shalt not lie because lying is wrong? But it's not wrong because the Bible teaches it. Rather, the Bible teaches it because it is wrong. And the $64,000 question is, probably nobody remembers that show, why is it wrong? Because God is truth. What is contrary to the person, character, and nature of God is false. That which coincides with the person, character, and nature of God is righteous. Not because the Bible says it. Jesus was confronting the religious leaders of his day, and they were boasting that they had, the Old Testament scriptures and all, so that made them special. Jesus said, you have the scriptures, and in them you think you have life. I cannot tell you how many Christians hold up their Bible and say, in this is life. That's ridiculous. Jesus said, no. You have life in me. How do you know that? Because of the Bible. The Bible was not given to be worshiped. The Bible was not given to be adored. The Bible was given that we might know how to worship him, that we might know how to adore him, that we might know him is the purpose of the Bible. And when we come to know him, then the Bible has fulfilled one of its main purposes. We've come to know the God creator of the scriptures. And here's the big difference. We'll get that right after the music.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll keep people waiting for the answer. And as we continue our conversation with Josh McDowell, set free to choose right, equipping today's kids to make right moral choices for life. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Some commentators are starting to call Generation Z as the screenagers. Let's first define some terms. The Generation Z, also known as Gen Z, are those young people who were born after the year 2000. They are the generation following the millennial generation. Dr. Stephen Finney says that Gen Z is compelled to create personal branding that is riddled with obsessive manicuring regarding their online presence. This compelling act is driven by a fleshly, self-life insecurity called people-pleasing. He has found that this generation is constantly aware, and therefore adjusting, how their peers view them. In other words, they put out a false image of themselves. He has also found out why the text language and other social media communication is so disjointed and nearly impossible to interpret. According to the Journal of Individual Psychology, Generation Z's lower cognitive regions, which stimulate impulse, are constantly being activated by the bombardment of neurological arousal provided by text messages, Facebook updates, and video games. And if you add to that what has been called the Google culture of learning, which assumes that you can find an answer to questions in seconds, you have a generation that finds it hard to think, write, and concentrate. What does this all mean? Dr. Finney concludes that within the next 15 years, we will see an entire generation with memory deprivation, difficulties in processing, lack of ability in proper grammar, attention span issues, and digital addictions. This is what can happen when young people spend too much time in front of a screen. Parents and church leaders need to warn these screenagers of the consequences of being addicted to their digital devices. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Josh McDowell. His book is entitled Set Free to Choose Right, Equipping Today's Kids to Make Right Moral Choices. You can certainly go to josh.org. Of course, we have all those links on our website for the book and all sorts of great information from Josh McDowell Ministries. And Josh, you were sharing with us some important principles. Certainly, we need to not only know what we believe, but why we believe it, and that is true as well. What are the moral rules and how those moral rules are tied to the character of God? But please continue.
Livy, can I make a comment on what you said on your point of view about Google?
Sure.
One of my staff, her daughter's 13 years old, and was having kind of a pleasant argument with her youth pastor who was trying to get her to study more. And this is where Generation Z is. She said, why should I have to study? I can Google it.
Yes.
And, that is true for a whole generation. But the difference between raising kids out of the person, character, and nature of God compared to out of a book, which is legalism. Now, the Bible is not legalistic, but the way people use it and teach it often is legalistic. It's the difference from raising your children relationally and raising your children legalistically. This is why it was so important for me to introduce my three daughters and my son to the Lord Jesus Christ, that they might come to know God in a personal way. Then that became the foundation for raising them on how to make right moral choices. And Dottie and I came up with 4 steps we used. And Kerby, does it work? And this is outlined in the book,
right,
the biblical basis for it, and a lot of illustrations. When you have a choice to make, 1, consider the choice.
Right.
you could make this choice, you could make that choice. This would happen if I would do that one. Then second, compare it to God. First, consider the choice, then compare it to God. Now, to do that, you have to raise your children to understand who God is, what are his attributes, what is true of God. And then third, you first consider the choice. Second, compare it to God. Third, and this is a tough one, commit to his way. And like Daniel purposed his heart not to defile himself. We need to make that commitment. That can be difficult for adults also. And then fourth, and this is the most beautiful one, consider the choice. Second, compare to God. Third, commit to his way. Fourth, count on his provision and protection. I always taught my children that every single commandment in the scriptures is positive. They say, come on, Dad, it says thou shalt not. I would say, honey, that's positive. How do you get a positive out of a negative? Well, every time God says thou shalt not is positive. Why? Because it's expression of the person, character, and nature of God. God is love. What does love mean? There's only one definition I know, protect and provide, from Ephesians 5, to protect and provide. So every single commandment of God is to protect you and to provide for you. Once you get that across to your children, their whole attitude would change, because then God is not a cosmic killjoy. All he wants to do is take all the fun out of life. He doesn't want me to do this, doesn't want me to do that. Why? Because he loves you. And that means he wants to protect you and provide for you. And in the book, Set Free to Make Right Choices, we share with parents how to understand this themselves. What does it mean to consider the choice and all? And then compare to God. So as a parent has got to come understand it first, or they will not pass it on to their children. And I know this, Kerby. My philosophy was, the more my children learn things first from me,
Yes,
or I will be their hero in life. And the more they will respond. That's why every week I tried to teach my kids something that they didn't know for the first time. Like I remember when I took them down to downtown Julian to the gas station, I showed each one of them at different times how to put air in the tires, how to use a gauge to check the air pressure, everything else. And as a result, my children grew up knowing, I learned that from my dad. I learned that from my dad. I learned that from my dad. And when you do that, the response cycle is so much better.
that is certainly the case, as you have pointed out before in the Why Wait series that you've done in the past, because if they hear from you about a biblical plan for sexuality, they're more likely to come to you. But if they hear it from somewhere else and they wonder, well, why didn't my mom or dad talk about this? I guess they don't know very much. It comes back to the fact that you become the primary dispenser of not only news, information, facts, but values and meaning. So again, so absolutely crucial. Again, as part of this book.
Kerby,
go ahead.
One thing I like about you, Kerby, you always have a grasp of the obvious.
That's good to know.
I'm serious. I am serious. You grasp things. I don't know another talk show host that grasps it as well as you do. There's others that are excellent out there. But I don't know, with your training experience, you're able to see things that others don't see, especially culturally, Kerby. And that's why it's fun to do interviews with you.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Let me again mention to our
you pay very well.
Yeah, I pay very well. Again, I would encourage people to write these down. Of course, they can get the book, but again, the 4 C's: consider the choice, compare it to God, commit it to God's way, and count on God's protection and provision. And again, that is something that you and Dottie have used with your children. Now, I'm sure you use it with your grandchildren. And it's just something that helps them begin to make wise choices, because ultimately the goal, Josh, is to put ourselves out of business. Because eventually, as we talked about yesterday, they're going to leave the home, they're going to go off to college, or they're going to go in the military, they're going to go in the business world, and they're going to have to make those choices without you looking over their shoulders. So if you teach them that at an early age, it will be so much of their hardwiring that that's the way they'll make decisions the rest of their life.
That's right. One reason I came up with these 4 C's is right after 9/11, I did an ebook called America, and then insert the church, has lost the right to judge. And I wrote this book on how Americans make moral choices. And part of the book, what I did, I went and bought 12, 14 textbooks used in high schools around the country and middle schools that teaches how to make moral choices. Every single one of them approached it this way. They either had 3 steps or 5 steps. I'll start with a simple 3-step one. That'll communicate it. Every one of them started out, consider the choice. Second, consider the consequences. But always the next step was, and this is so dangerous, but this is how Americans are learning to make moral choice, said, make the choice that is best for you. Not make the choice that is right, not make the choice that is moral, not make the choice that's best for most people, but make the choice that is best for you. That would justify every evil in the world. That would justify the Parkland shooting. I will guarantee you, the young man who killed those 17 students considered the choice, looked at the consequences, and made the choice he thought was best for him, go kill 17 people. So how in the world can Parkland teachers criticize him?
Well, again, that's kind of that utilitarian idea, either best for you or the greatest good for the greatest number, but none of it is an attempt to apply it to basic absolute moral principles. So again, that's, I think, an illustration of why you put this book together, because we need to train a whole generation of adults so that they can train their children and their grandchildren to make wise moral choices, right?
Yes, and this is why in the, most of my books I do this, I have a storyline that goes through it that's a composite of true stories.
Mm-hmm.
And in this storyline, they're dealing with pornography.
Yes.
Why? I commissioned the largest study ever to be done on pornography, $250,000. Instead of 300 interviews, they did 3,000 scientific interviews. And it was all focused on the church. And this is what it showed of Christian young people. 56% would say not recycling is a moral sin. Only 32% would say porn is.
I know. Amazing.
Whoa.
Whoa is right.
And Chuck Swindoll called me before I hosted the summit on pornography a year and a half ago. He said, Josh, pornography is the greatest cancer in the history of the church. We have never faced, parents have never, ever, ever come close to facing an issue like pornography.
Wow.
That would literally destroy their children and their family. I would say from 18, 21 years old and younger, among Christians, porn is totally natural, normal, and mainstream.
Wow. Let me jump in real quickly because we have a break that we have to take. And again, we want to come back and talk about the porn phenomenon, the impact of pornography on the digital age. A survey done a couple of years ago, 3,000 teens, adults, church youth, senior pastors. We want to share a little bit more about some of those facts and figures. But we need to take a mandatory break. We're talking with Josh McDowell about his book, Set Free to Choose Right. We'll be right back.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Josh McDowell. His new book, Set Free to Choose Right, equipping today's kids to make right moral choices for life. Unfortunately, we have a generation that says, well, I have the right to decide what is right and wrong, and unfortunately, sometimes the culture even reinforces those values. And Josh, just before we went to the break, you mentioned this really groundbreaking study. If I can say that this has been so helpful even in my own life. I sit on a board where for years we've had speakers going into secular classrooms and in high school classrooms, and even sometimes grade school classrooms, talking about abstinence, drugs. We've developed a whole new set of material on sexting and on pornography and a number of other things, and all of it came from, of course, the research that you did. 3,000 surveys called The Porn Phenomenon, the Impact of Pornography on the Digital Age. And you were sharing one just arresting statistic where 56% cite that not recycling is morally wrong, but only 32% cited viewing pornography as morally wrong. You can see how the culture has affected our young people. Maybe we don't have Josh, and so we'll see if we can get Josh back here, but if not, we'll cover some of the other issues as well. When discussing porn with their friends, about 90% of the teens, about 96% of the young adults say they do so in a neutral, accepting, or encouraging manner. And Josh, do you have any comments about that?
Yes. The study was done based on not being born again, or an evangelical, but being a young, active Christian. And with watching pornography, wasn't, have you seen pornography or what? No. Do you actively seek out pornography in the internet?
Well,
and this is important because every study you know is a little different. So when I would say a Christian, it was somebody who would be designated as an active Christian. They pray, they read the scriptures, they go to church. Second, when I say they look at porn means, not that it passed 2 years ago, passed by your screen, so you have to say, I watched porn, but rather that you actively seek it out. Now, let me give you 5 statistics.
Yes.
Now think, this is the evangelical church. Of 13 to 18-year-olds, 81% actively seek out porn.
Mm.
Of 18 to 24-year-olds, 76% actively seek out porn. Of 36 to 60-year-olds, 47% do. Of 25 to 39-year-olds, 65% actively seek out porn. That comes out to about 65% of everyone sitting in the pews actively seek out porn. Of women 18 to 34, 56% actively seek out porn. Now, I don't know how the church can survive that if we don't reverse it.
Yes. And just that last statistic was one where I was speaking in a group and I was talking about, the problem men have with pornography and everything. And at the first break, this woman comes up to me and said, I'm really offended you're talking about this being only a problem with men because it's a problem for me. And I thought, well, okay, that got my attention real fast because she felt that this was something that was applying to individuals that were male or female, old or young. One of the other arresting statistics is the number of people in ministry, the number of youth pastors and pastors in porn. Of course, that's another thing that you surfaced in that study that was called the porn phenomenon, right?
Well, taking our study and several others by Barna, by Pure Desire, and Proven Men, I would put it at about 57% of evangelical pastors actively seek out porn on the internet, about 60% of youth pastors. A youth pastor said to me recently, he said, of all the kids that come to me for counseling, 90% is about pornography.
Wow.
In the Catholic Church, of confessionals all over the world, 63% of all confessionals is about pornography. With the young Mormon missionaries that return home, over 75% are addicted to porn. And the same thing is true in evangelical missionary groups. And look at Cru. Now, I hate to mention this because immediately your listeners will reflect a negative view on Campus Crusade for Christ, Cru. But it's the same for Navigators, InterVarsity, Young Life, Youth for Christ, and every denomination you have. In one of our largest divisions of Cru, it's probably larger than 90% of all nonprofits in the world. But this division of ours, since January 1, has had 276 applications for staff. Now, Kerby, you know, we get the cream of the crop.
Yes, you do.
Of Dallas Seminary, Southwestern, of the university, everything. And this is what it showed. 90% of all the men pursue pornography, and it's 81%. 99% of the men, 81% of the women pursue pornography. And those are those that are applying for Campus Crusade for Christ staff.
That's amazing. And
Kerby,
I think
that is not amazing. That is
discouraging.
devastating.
Yeah, devastating. It also explains something that has crossed my mind. I know we've had Noel Boucher in here of Pure Hope, or we've talked about different aspects of whenever it's come up. I've always, in the back of my mind, always thought, well, if this is such a big problem in the church, why doesn't the pastor address this? Because you can remember at some of these men's conferences, we certainly have addressed this over the years, and some of the various opportunities to begin to challenge people to live a godly life or a pure life. But again, maybe now your study helps us understand that individuals that are struggling with that in the pews are also being led by people who are struggling with that in the pulpit. And so maybe that's why we're not having that very important issue being addressed on a regular basis.
There's three basic reasons why pastors don't address it. This came from two of the top Christian names in America that is respected by everyone. And from my own research, three reasons. One, shame.
Yes, shame.
Second, fear of exposure. Third, ignorance. That's probably 85% of the reasons why churches don't address it. Shame, fear of exposure, and ignorance. See, most people don't realize how big porn is. When homeschooling Christian moms and others will say, oh, Josh, this might be true of other kids, but we homeschool our child. We can protect our child. We pray for them. We have family devotions. We have good curriculum on the Bible and all. And I'll look at that mother and say, you got to be crazy. Yes, your child is a good child. Yes, your child will probably not look for pornography. But lady, you missed the point. Pornography is looking for your child, and absolutely 1,000% will find your child, period. Just to show you, there's 26 million pornographic websites I can access right here in my dining room right now. 2.3 billion pages. Just one site. Now, Kerby, this is just one of 26 million sites. In the last 12 months, distributed 3,119 petabytes of pornographic data. Now, we can't even think in 1 petabyte, let alone 3,119. If printed out, one site in 12 months, if printed out, would be 1.7 trillion pages. It would take you over 300,000 years to sit down right now and count to 1.7 trillion. Over 300,000 years to count it. If printed out and placed in 4-drawer file cabinets, it would fill 20 billion 4-drawer file cabinets. Of those 20 billion 4-drawer file cabinets from only one site, 6.8 billion of them were watched by children. Another site, only 2 of 26 million, every single day last year it distributed 1.3 petabytes of data, which means if printed out, every day it would fill the Empire State Building. Another site, which makes 3 out of 26 million, every second they begin showing 4,000 more pornographic videos.
Incredible.
And parents think they can protect their child. It's impossible.
It is. Let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Josh
Let's talk about
McDowell.
the solution.
That's what we're going to do. And what can we do? What can pastors do? What can you as parents do? We're going to talk about that with Josh McDowell right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Veterans memorials are symbols meant to remind the living of the service and sacrifice the fallen made for freedom. That is why Gold Star Mothers in 1919 started work on the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial. They did not want the world to forget the sacrifice their sons made, so they, along with the American Legion, erected a cross-shaped memorial. The design mirrored the universally accepted symbol erected over the thousands of graves of men who died in Europe defending freedom. No one complained for almost 100 years. Recently, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit refused to overturn an opinion of a panel of that court that would direct a federal district court to consider whether the monument should have its horizontal arms removed or be razed to the ground completely. Such a decision sets a dangerous precedent for veterans memorials across America. If this decision stands, other memorials will be targeted for destruction as well. First Liberty Institute will appeal this case to the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of its clients, the American Legion. I encourage you to go to don'ttearmedown.com and join us in defending this memorial to the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, killed in the line of duty during World War I. We forget what we do not see. Unless the Supreme Court intervenes, the Bladensburg Memorial and similar memorials in close by Arlington National Cemetery may disappear as well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Privileged to have with us today Josh McDowell for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Set Free to Choose Right, Equipping Today's Kids to Make Right Moral Choices. If you'd like to know about the book, it's about 200 pages, but let me just say that almost 40 pages of that is the porn phenomenon, the impact of pornography in the digital age. That was the report done by the Barna Group for Josh McDowell's ministry. And Josh, of course, the obvious question, what can we do to stem the porno plague in our lives, in our communities? Can you give us some action items?
Yes. There's 4 different avenues you would take on solution. I'll take the one, how do we protect our children for the sake of the child? 1, you need to develop, and this is where pastors and churches should help parents, develop a loving, intimate, secure home environment relationship where that child, your child, will feel absolutely, totally safe and free to ask you anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean anything, without judgment, without shame, and without starting to quote the Bible. You do that later. Second, we have to develop into our children, I believe, by 5 years old, because the average age of children seeing pornography is 8. And if you don't have certain things built into the life by the first time they see it, and they're going to see it, it's not if they will see it, it's when they will see it,
Yes.
then you will lose your child. You need to build in a beautiful, biblically based, godly perspective of marriage and sex. Why did God create sex? I mean, you need to teach out of Proverbs where most men and women will blush if they knew what Proverbs was saying. We now have to ingrain it into our children's lives. But the first time they see porn, they need a certain healthy view of sexuality. Why? Because if they don't have it, and 95% of Christian kids don't, the first time they see porn, they will not be able to detect a counterfeit from the original. The overwhelming majority of Christian young people from 5 years old up to 21 years old thinks pornography is a biblical view of sex. Why? Because almost 80% of all Christian parents have never even used the word porn, let alone ever explained it to their child. And then third or fourth, you need to build into that child a goal for their life, something great to live for, which would all be centered around and under Christ's lordship. For example, with my son, it was basketball. You know, Sean.
Oh, sure.
He, from middle school up, he was going to play ball in college, and he did, and he was academic All-American.
Yeah.
He would have never let pornography enter his life because he knew it would affect his basketball. It might be photography. For my one daughter, it was track. It was running track. She just lived for it every day, which was wonderful because I'd rather have her run track than play with boys or watch porn. And she would never let porn enter her life. For my other daughter, it was being a doctor.
Yes.
She had such high goals in her life for what she wanted to do at a very young age. Porn, she would not let derail her. And then on top of that, what we can do is we need to teach our children, come to us.
Yes.
With any question, any doubt you have, say no and then ask us. That means, Mom and Dad, you're going to have to show that when your child comes to you, no matter how coarse that question is, you don't smile, you don't act modestly, or we don't talk about that or anything because you just lost your child. In a very loving way, you put your arm around that child, that son, that daughter. You thank them over and over and over again for asking you that question. And then you answer it in a very straightforward, correct way. The reason is, at even 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, you kind of don't want to talk about the real frankness of sex, so you kind of beat around the bush, call their penis a ding-dong or something else. You will lose all credibility with your children. Why? Because whether you teach them or not, everything they hear, they're going to Google. Google has become the number one sex educator of children in every single culture in the world, especially the United States. And Mom, Dad, you better be. This is why I did the book called, what's it called?
Set Free to Choose Right. Yeah.
Naked Truth. The bare facts.
Okay.
I wrote that book from the medical perspective of sexuality and everything, so parents can be accurate. Because if you are not accurate, Mom, your kid's gonna Google it, and all they have to do is find out once or twice that you covered it up, you weren't straightforward. They will not come to you again.
That's right.
It's like we're not letting kids grow up and have adolescence.
So again, just some great principles. Again, the book, Set Free to Choose Right, Equipping Today's Kids to Make Right Moral Choices. Again, we talked about the 4 C's, the process of consider, compare, commit, count. Of course, it also has excerpts from the porn phenomenon and some great resources all available at the book. But Josh, just before I let you go, let's talk about what's available at josh.org, because there are just so many other resources that parents and pastors and other individuals in our listening audience can benefit from.
You can go to josh.org/talks or resources. You can download over 2,000 PowerPoints, transcripts of my talks, everything. You can download 380 pages. Within 1 week, you'll be able to. 380 pages called the Gen Z. Who is Generation Z from about 23 years old down to 8? How can you parent a Gen Z? How do you hire a Gen Z into your company, whatever? How do you disciple a Gen Z? And then you can go there, you can download, it's about 600 pages of documentation called The Father Factor. And I'll tell you, for pastors, for Father's Day coming up, it's got all the research, the data, everything completely documented for you. And I would say within 1 month, it'll have on there about 6,000 pages of the most research ever done on pornography. I put it all together over the last 5 years. It'll have about a 75-page executive summary where you can go to josh.org/resources, download the porn epidemic executive summary, and you can read that, and then all the documentation, everything for it is in the 6,000 pages you can look at. And then you can go to setfreetomakerightchoices.com and download many helps for teaching this book to your children, the principles of it all. And also, we put up there the 7 P's of parenting, 7 principles on how to develop a loving, intimate relationship with your child, no matter how old they are, that they'll end up responding instead of rebellion in the majority of the cases. Just go to Set Free to Make Right Choices, the title of the book, .com. You can download it all free, the same on my site.
Outstanding. Josh McDowell, always great to have you on the program. We value the research that you do, and I know I'm going to take some of this and produce various commentaries and other conversation points with that. And thank you so very much for doing the good work that we can now expose to as many people as possible.
Thank you. What a privilege to be with you, my friend. God bless.
Let's take a break. When we come back in the next hour, I'll open up the phones. Perhaps you have some comments about some of the things that we have discussed. 1-800-351-1212. Set Free to Choose Right. Josh McDowell's been with us. Perhaps you have some comments about parenting, pornography, the internet. It's all fair game. 1-800-351-1212. What are your thoughts? We'll take those calls right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It's an open line. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you just joined us last hour, we had a chance to talk with Josh McDowell about his new book, Set Free to Choose Right. I'll have a couple of final comments to say about that. Then I want to get into some of the issues in the news. We, of course, have this caravan of immigrants headed towards the southern border of the United States. Although Mexico is now talking about the fact that maybe they've disbanded some of the caravan. I don't believe it, but that's certainly one issue that we'll put on the table. And I think over the next couple of weeks, immigration is going to be front and center, because not only that, but you have the citizenship question that will be on the census that has become so controversial, and a number of other topics we will cover. So if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Josh McDowell certainly wrote this book because he is convinced that we have a problem because of the internet. As he points out, the internet has changed so much, and one part of the book relates to what is called the porn phenomenon. We mentioned that last hour, and I'd love to get some of your comments about that as well. It was a study that he did actually now about 2 years ago. Barna Research Group spent about $250,000. Huge study, 3,000 teens, adults, church youth, senior pastors, primarily looking at, well, is this a problem inside the church? Yes, it is. And again, all sorts of facts, but a couple of ones that I might mention just real quickly. 56% cited not recycling as morally wrong. Only 32% cited viewing pornography as morally wrong for them. So the point he's making is that the younger generation does not hold to kind of the same standards about pornography as the previous generation. Also, one that I mentioned just in passing, when discussing porn with their friends, 90% of teens, 96% of young adults say they did so kind of in a neutral, accepting, or encouraging manner, and certainly that is of concern. And an astounding 70% of American young people today fail to embrace the concept that there is a universal standard for right and wrong. So that may explain why you have all sorts of statistics. For example, 65% believe that premarital sex is acceptable. 36% of those surveyed don't think that sex before marriage is a moral issue. Same study found that 58% of the population endorse homosexuality as a valid lifestyle. And many of the kind of conversations we've had here on Point of View illustrate that we have a very changing and significantly changing moral standard or moral foundation. So again, one of the keys to this, if you didn't have a chance to write it down, you might get something to write with. And just number 1 to 4, it's what he calls the 4 C's, and it's the 4 C's process. You know, how can we help our children and our grandchildren make wise decisions? And so the first C was consider, that is, consider the choice. Consider the choice. What are your choices? What are your options for that particular decision? Number 2, the second C is compare, that is, compare it to God. And right off the bat, that's how it differs from all these other books that talk about ethics, because oftentimes it's consider the choice, consider the consequences, do what is best for you, what is right for you, which is kind of hedonism or utilitarianism, depending on what ism you want to look at there. But consider, number 1, the choice. Number 2, compare it to God. If you're taking notes, the third C is commit to God's way. how important that is, to commit to do it the right way, to commit to doing it the way God has instructed you to do it. And then the final C, count on God's protection and provision. That is kind of a summary of some of the middle chapters of the book. But again, consider the choice, compare it to God, commit it to God's way, count on God's protection and provision. And so it's just, again, an illustration of some of the real significant changes that have taken place because of what? The Internet. When I wrote my book a number of years ago that related to the issue of ethics, at that time it was called Moral Dilemmas, I was already struck at that time, as that book part of the Swindoll Leadership Library, how the Internet had changed so much. The Internet, of course, had changed pornography, but the Internet had changed some other things as well. My chapter on gambling now talked about online gambling. My chapter on adultery now talked about online affairs. So you can see that so many of these moral issues that we deal with now in the 21st century have really been affected by the Internet. And if you get my commentary, you know that it landed in your inbox today. But if you did not, one of the things I would encourage you to do is go to our website, pointofview.net, and my commentary today is about screenagers. That's teenagers looking at screens. And it's primarily looking at the Generation Z. Those would be those born after 2000, generally. Some use 1998. I'm not going to quibble about that, but that's the number I use. And Dr. Stephen Finney in my commentary talks about the fact that Gen Z, that is the generation under the millennial generation, is compelled to create personal branding that is riddled with obsessive manicuring, that is, regarding their online presence. In other words, they're trying to present their best image to the world, and, of course, it relates to what he calls people-pleasing. And he's found that this generation is constantly aware, and therefore adjusting, how their peers view them, and so they're really putting out kind of a false image of themselves. But also in my piece, I talk about how there are those who have been looking at this generation that has always grown up with technology. Because even when we talk, as we will tomorrow, with our millennial generation, I know, for example, that Chelsea Human says, I really didn't even have a cell phone until I was in high school, maybe even later in high school. But you have a whole generation now, the younger generation, the so-called Generation Z, that's always had technology, always had access to a phone, always had access to an iPad or a screen of some sort. Well, the Journal of Individual Psychology says that Gen Z's lower cognitive regions, which stimulate impulse, are constantly being activated by a bombardment of neurological arousal provided by text messages, Facebook updates, and video games. In other words, they live in this world where there's just this cacophony, this confusion of all this neural input. And then also, as is said, it is also affected by the Google culture of learning, which assumes I can find an answer in seconds. Used to be that young people would sometimes say, why do I need to learn the multiplication tables? I have a calculator. Now they're saying, why do I need to learn anything? Because I have Google, which is pretty amazing. But Dr. Finney concludes the commentary, which I have a quote from here, by saying within the next 15 years, we'll see an entire generation with memory deprivation, difficulties in processing, lack of ability in proper grammar, attention span issues, that is the length of time for when a person is able to concentrate on a particular activity, and digital distractions. And that's what I say in my commentary, what happens when young people spend too much time in front of a screen. And that's why I think we as parents and grandparents and church leaders need to warn these screenagers of the consequences of being addicted to their digital devices. And as we shared in the first hour, why we need to warn them about the dangers of being addicted to pornography. So that's why we've done some of these programs. If you have some comments about that, certainly would welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We come back, though, want to talk about the caravan headed towards our southern border. What does that mean, and how do we think about this? We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Some commentators are starting to call Generation Z as the screenagers. Let's first define some terms. The Generation Z, also known as Gen Z, are those young people who were born after the year 2000. They are the generation following the millennial generation. Dr. Stephen Finney says that Gen Z is compelled to create personal branding that is riddled with obsessive manicuring regarding their online presence. This compelling act is driven by a fleshly, self-life insecurity called people-pleasing. He has found that this generation is constantly aware, and therefore adjusting, how their peers view them. In other words, they put out a false image of themselves. He has also found out why the text language in other social media communication is so disjointed and nearly impossible to interpret. According to the Journal of Individual Psychology, Generation Z's lower cognitive regions, which stimulate impulse, are constantly being activated by the bombardment of neurological arousal provided by text messages, Facebook updates, and video games. And if you add to that what has been called the Google culture of learning, which assumes that you can find an answer to questions in seconds, you have a generation that finds it hard to think, write, and concentrate. What does this all mean? Dr. Finney concludes that within the next 15 years, we will see an entire generation with memory deprivation, difficulties in processing, lack of ability in proper grammar, attention span issues, and digital addictions. This is what can happen when young people spend too much time in front of a screen. Parents and church leaders need to warn these screenagers of the consequences of being addicted to their digital devices. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to talk about immigration and our border security for just a few minutes, and the reason for that is we are starting to see something that has developed over time. In late March, actually March 25th, a caravan set out from the Mexico-Guatemala border, and I'll get more into that in just a minute. That caravan of immigrants, more than 1,000, some estimated 5,000, I think that number was too high, but more than 1,000 of these individuals headed north. Now, the implication is that they wanted to take this caravan from the southern border of Mexico to the southern border of the United States. Now, if you think that this is spontaneous, you haven't been around very long because this is almost becoming an annual event. But I thought for just a minute I'd give you some of the background, and then how do we kind of think about what is taking place here. And it's really important to understand that some of this is happening simply because the Mexican government has allowed it to happen. It also has been something that the president, Donald Trump, has been addressing, which has caused the Mexican government to kind of change some of their policies. But again, the caravan, according to Chris Reeves in a piece that he put out, consists of over 1,000 members being organized by the activist group Pueblos Sin Fronteras, which is People Without Borders. And so, as you might imagine, if your title of your organization is People Without Borders, as he said, they're probably not too keen on immigration laws or state borders. Matter of fact, if you look at their website, and I would encourage you to do that, you can see that they make demands about human rights. They want to provide humanitarian aid to migrants, and they do this to really bring attention to the plight of those primarily most of these coming from Honduras, but you could look at other countries south of the Mexican border, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and others. And on March 25th, as I mentioned, the caravan first set out from the Mexico-Guatemala border and Talachupla, heading towards the first kind of internal border control outpost, and that's in the small town of Huehuetan. And interestingly enough, if you look at their Facebook page, you see all sorts of people celebrating because they passed this. Again, we were talking about a border control at the border of Mexico, and it would have been apparently abandoned by the Mexican guards, which is one of the reasons why you've had President Donald Trump complain about the fact that Mexico has allowed this to take place. You have seen kind of his shift in the last week or so from maybe saying we can maybe come up with some kind of deal for DACA and for those who are here illegally to actually blaming the Democrats for that failure, actually being concerned about the fact that the Mexican government is not taking a stronger action to close their border, which would then be a stronger action to prevent them from coming across the Mexican border into the United States. And, of course, you have seen this sort of play itself out. Adolfo Flores has actually been traveling with this caravan, and he has a piece that appears in BuzzFeeds. And he says that now Mexico's National Institute of Immigration said yesterday that it plans tomorrow, that would be Wednesday, to try to disband this caravan of Central American migrants because they have said that they would let pregnant women and people with disabilities stay while others would then be required to leave. And so, again, the offer that they have put forward is an offer to allow the most vulnerable in the caravan to stay. That would be those who, for example, are pregnant women, people with disabilities, or in some cases, people with chronic illnesses like HIV. And so that's kind of been the plan. Now, the Mexican authorities said that those people who decide to stay would not be allowed to travel to the U.S. border, but they would be allowed to move around Mexico freely. Now, think this through for just a minute. Do you really think that some of them are just going to move around Mexico, or if they are then allowed to stay, they will see if they can make it across the border to the United States? And, of course, the members of the caravan who are not given that kind of visa, that kind of asylum, they are now saying that they're going to head to the state of Puebla to actually participate in some workshops for migrant rights, and then on to Mexico City. And those who said that the caravan will continue on say that they will carry on and stay with it as long as it's held together. So even though there is a report that Mexico, as the government, is now trying to do what it can to disband the caravan, I just have my doubts. And, of course, they have been traveling now, for about 9 days. And if they continue far enough north, they'll then try to, of course, make their way into the United States. The idea was that some of them will then apply for asylum. Others will try to sneak across the border, run across the border, whatever it might be. And, of course, you're going to be hearing about immigration issues for some time, if for no other reason than that is the case. Gary Bauer, who, of course, is with us on a fairly regular basis, writes American Values. And his piece yesterday talked about this, and I thought you might just give you some perspective on it. He says, you may have heard the news that roughly 1,000 migrants, mostly from Honduras, are on a long march through Mexico to the United States. They're led by an organization called People Without Borders. And Gary Bauer says, the name tells you everything you need to know, and it is wrong because, as he says, borders define nations and their people. But he goes on to say that, we as Christians have to kind of think this through for just a minute, because he says, I suspect that many well-meaning people in churches across the country yesterday, meaning Sunday, were talking about this caravan. They may be confused and divided about the appropriate response to this situation. Many are likely told that there are 1,000 hurting people who need our compassion. So that's when Gary asks a question, and I want to put that on the table for your comments as well. What if it was not 1,000 people coming across our border, but say 5,000 people coming across our border? Or maybe not 1,000 people crossing the border, but maybe 10,000 people crossing the border? What if it's 1 million people crossing our border, or 150 million? Now, why does he use that phrase? Why does he use that number? Well, he says, first of all, there are several billion people who could make a poverty or compassion claim to demand entry into the United States, and each year we legally admit 1 million immigrants. But if you look at one survey that came out a while back, that survey showed there are probably 150 million people around the world that would like to come here, and at that point, that's why he uses that number. We can't let them all in. He says it's not compassionate to allow more people into the country than we can assimilate. It's not compassionate to allow more people into the country than the American taxpayer can support. And so this is why, of course, you've seen President Donald Trump calling out Congress right now for its lax immigration laws and weaker border security policies. And he says, good for him. In the days ahead, every politician, he says, should be forced to go on the record about what exactly they would do with this migrant caravan and whether they believe we should be a nation without borders. This is a good question to ask. Some of you that are in the listening audience are in states where there's already been a primary, but many of the rest of you are in states right now where there are primaries yet to be held. That's a question you need to ask some of those candidates asking for your support. And all of us in the listening audience will be able to vote for individuals in the general election in November. And those particular elections are key. 35 U.S. Senate races, 435 races for the House of Representatives. But even now, you have to recognize, you have to pay attention to who is running as the governor. Because does your particular governor want your state to be a sanctuary state? Some of you live in states that already have done that. Some of you maybe are going to vote for a mayor or a city council. Do they want their city to be a sanctuary city? And what do they think about this caravan? And should we actually be a nation without borders? I think those are good questions. And they're questions not only I ask of you, but it's most importantly questions you need to ask of those individuals who are asking for your vote in these upcoming midterm elections. So when we come back, let me take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, and also get into another issue that is related to immigration, because I suspect this is going to be an issue that we're going to be talking about for some time, and that has to do with one of the articles we've posted on our website, and it has to do with whether or not we should ask on the census whether or not you're a citizen of the United States. We used to do that. We haven't done it in some time. Is that a reasonable question? And the piece by Scott Moorfield, I think, is a good question, and that is, if indeed there is such a overreaction, I would have to say, from some liberals to the census citizenship question, maybe that's reason enough to push for it, because there might be some reasons that aren't being discussed right now. We'll talk about that and take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, or sit back and listen. You will find some articles that we're talking about here on the website, pointofview.net. And I thought for just a minute I'd get into this citizenship question again. It is something that the Trump administration has decided to include in the 2020 census. Of course, you've had Democrats that have said that this would maybe change the representation. In a minute, I'm going to respond to that. But by the way, that's the argument. And of course, you've had first the leader of the Attorney General's office in California, New York, and some others calling that into question. So one of the reasons I posted this piece by Scott Moorfield is that it's an interesting argument, and it's one I've made before. When people react so much to something, sometimes that's a reason to look at it a little bit more. I remember last week when we just brought this up in passing on our Millennia Roundtable off air, Nick Pitts and I were talking about this, and Nick said, I could make a case for asking the question. I could just as easily make a question against. And for both of us, kind of like, well, it's kind of a coin flip. It's not something we really thought about a whole lot. There's a reason the Justice Department asked for that, and the argument has to do with the Voting Rights Act, and that's one of the reasons why even some in the Wall Street Journal have said this maybe isn't such a good idea. But let me get into Scott Moorfield's piece and then take some of your phone calls, because he reminds us that even though you have these lawsuits that have now come from California, New York, and other places, it is really important to understand the context. And here's the context. Scott Moorfield says, never mind that the Justice Department asked the census officials to include the question so they could better enforce the Voting Rights Act. And that's an important issue that certainly is important, because it's also, again, an attempt to sort of begin to count by race and also by citizenship and a number of other things that actually seem to be almost mandated by the Voting Rights Act. But nevertheless, we'll leave that there. Also, he says, never mind the fact that the Trump administration never stated that they weren't planning to actually count non-citizens. So some of these arguments that are being made against it right now are fallacious because they aren't really relevant to what actually will take place. But a little history's in order, and that is prior to the 1960 census, a citizenship question was regularly included in the form. It even still has appeared on the long form for many years, and there is a reason for that, because it is sort of mandated by the immigration legislation that was passed back in 1965. So the real issue, I think, has to do with power, in particular political power. And it's best illustrated by the fact that a Washington Post headline the other day read, potential citizenship question in the 2020 census could shift power to rural America. Now, the argument that has been made by the Attorney General of California and others, matter of fact, in an editorial that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, is, quote, California with its large immigrant communities would be disproportionately harmed by depressed participation in the 2020 census. An undercount could threaten at least one of the California seats in the House of Representatives, and by extension an elector in the Electoral College. It could deprive California cities and counties of their fair share of billions of dollars in federal funds. Well, the argument is this would hurt just blue states and not red states. Well, okay, let's look at the numbers. Not so much true, because if an underaccount actually exists, you could see how that would affect actually probably more red states than blue states. Think about this. For our listeners in Arizona, in Yuma, Arizona, 10% of the undocumented immigrants in Yuma, Arizona. Undocumented immigrants in McDowell, Texas, 10%. How about our listeners in Georgia? You go to Gainesville, Georgia, 10% there as well. How about Florida? Miami, 7% right there. Compare that to Los Angeles, 7%, New York City, 5%, Chicago, 4%. So certainly California could be affected, but so would other states as well, if indeed that's the big issue. And then one more. The argument that is made that, well, this would cause illegal immigrants to not fill out their forms. Well, you have some of those. If you look at the long form right now, those who declined was about 3%. Now, if you look at just the census form where it doesn't ask the question anyway, the so-called short form, sometimes people have estimated that could be as high as 40%. And that's when you've had posters saying no INS, no FBI, no CIA, no IRS posters in immigrant communities that were just trying to collect data, it's been hard to get them to actually fill them out in the first place. And, of course, the last issue, of course, is public perception that Scott Moorfield talks about, because he says, the typical line from a lot of people is, hey, there's nothing to see here. Actually, the actual number of immigrants has been around 11 million. We've used that same number for decades. And there's some people that are just starting to say, is it really 11 million? Many people believe it's closer to 20 million. Ann Coulter, of course, in her book, suggests it could be upwards of 40 million that are here illegally. And, of course, if we found those numbers, that might change the whole immigration debate. So, interesting set of circumstances, but nevertheless, we wanted you to have a chance to think about this, because this whole citizenship question on the census form is one that has become kind of a lightning rod. And so that's one of the reasons we posted that article on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take some phone calls, though. We'll head out to Georgia, one of those states I just mentioned a minute ago. And, Jay, what would you add to our conversation today as we're talking about immigration?
Hey, man, how you doing?
I'm good.
Well, immigration. Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Immigration, and one thing, I don't like the use of the term illegal immigrant, because a lot of these guys over here are not immigrants. Because they send money back home to the country they wish to return to. That's not the definition of an immigrant.
Well, that's probably true.
They're not all workers. They're all aliens. Now, if you're over here legally, that's a whole different story. But, see, what aggravates me the most, I'm married to a Hispanic woman for 26 years. I've had issues with people that I've known for years that suddenly think I'm racist because I just happen to be white. They didn't have a problem with me years ago, but now, because I support my country and I support legal immigration, I'm a racist. They paint everybody they disagree with as being a racist. There's no middle ground. They go right for the throat. You don't believe in homosexual marriage, you must be a bigot. There is no tolerance. Nothing but hypocrisy is coming from the left. There is no liberal logic. Nothing is left but far left extremists.
Well, first of all, as I've said on this program so often, the phrases racist, xenophobic, Hitler, whatever, are so overused as to become meaningless. When everybody is called a racist, nobody's a racist. If everybody's Hitler, then nobody's Hitler, and Hitler's not Hitler. And that's the problem. That phrase is used all the time to, of course, shut people up. It's not an attempt to try to engage in a civil dialogue, but it's simply an attempt to try to shut people up or to prevent any kind of further conversation. And we used to live in a culture not so long ago, Jay, where you would try to make an argument and the person with the best argument would win. Now it's the attempt to shut people down and to shut people up. And I think you've seen a good example of that in your own life. So if nothing else, I appreciate you sharing that. And it's just a reminder again of this volatile culture where it's easier to vilify your opponent than to try to make a compelling argument to make your case over his or her case. So, Jay, I appreciate you calling in today.
Yeah, just want to say this, that first of all, the way conservatives are viewed, you've got people that are moderate conservatives and you got people that are far right conservatives, but I don't see anything right now in the Republican Party that I would call far right extremists. I see far left extremists coming on the left wing. But arguments the left is making that if somebody doesn't agree with homosexual marriage, they're a bigot. Well, this is not taught. But the truth is, back in 1974, psychiatrists removed homosexuality from a list of mental disorders.
That is correct.
It was not, thank you, sir, not done because of any scientific breakthrough. It was in San Francisco, homosexuals rioted from across the country. And due to political pressure, it was removed from the ASTM manual as a disorder.
Yep, that is correct. I have some of that, of course, in our book on homosexuality and even in our booklet on homosexual theology. Need to take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Veterans memorials are symbols meant to remind the living of the service and sacrifice the fallen made for freedom. That is why Gold Star Mothers in 1919 started work on the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial. They did not want the world to forget the sacrifice their sons made, so they, along with the American Legion, erected a cross-shaped memorial. The design mirrored the universally accepted symbol erected over the thousands of graves of men who died in Europe defending freedom. No one complained for almost 100 years. Recently, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit refused to overturn an opinion of a panel of that court that would direct a federal district court to consider whether the monument should have its horizontal arms removed or be razed to the ground completely. Such a decision sets a dangerous precedent for veterans memorials across America. If this decision stands, other memorials will be targeted for destruction as well. First Liberty Institute will appeal this case to the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of its clients, the American Legion. I encourage you to go to don'ttearmedown.com and join us in defending this memorial to the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, killed in the line of duty during World War I. We forget what we do not see. Unless the Supreme Court intervenes, the Bladensburg Memorial and similar memorials in close by Arlington National Cemetery may disappear as well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. You know, Jay made a good point about the fact that sometimes today we don't engage in any kind of civil dialogue. It is simply an attempt to destroy the other person. And a good example of that you will find in one of the articles we've posted here, which has the title Progressive Boycotts, but it really goes back to a piece written by David French, in which he says David Hogg isn't a bully, his adult allies are. And he's talking about the fact that, of course, he says, state the obvious. There's not a single American corporation, media entity, or adult activist who actually takes direction from David Hogg or any other of the victims of Parkland. Every single thing they do is a response that is done willingly, gleefully even, and they simply use him as a tool. And he says this is how the pitiful game works. He says, Hogg, egged on by cheering adults, says vicious, cruel, and even false things about their political opponents. They all cheer loudly. They love it. They quite obviously can't get enough of it. In this way, Hogg is an expression of the liberal id, he says, a person who destroys the opposition in ways that are far more savage and intended far more personally than anything you see out of late-night television. So he says that's the sword. The shield comes when a conservative takes the bait. All the slicing and dicing and insulting and trolling causes the inevitable backlash. You get the unhinged backlash. He's a crisis actor. The mean backlash, laughing at Hogg's college admission struggles, or the thoughtful backlash. He's right to his rage and pain, but he's still wrong on substance. Yet for all too many activists, any criticism is attacking the Parkland kids. And so they become sort of untouchable. So then he says now the Laura Ingraham advertiser boycott is a perfect example of the process at work. Ingraham tweeted an ungracious and ridiculous assault at him, accusing him of whining about his college rejections, and he responded by calling for an advertiser boycott of Ingram's show. She apologized. He rejected her apology, and by now, at least today, you have more than a dozen companies that have pulled their advertisements from Ingram's show. Well, he says, so here we are once again. While advertisers, of course, have every right and legal right to boycott, the response to offensive speech in the marketplace of ideas isn't better speech, but rather an effort to use raw economic power to punish your political enemies. Transgress one of the ever-shifting lines of public discourse, even if you apologize, and you're instantly fighting for your job. So the point he's making here is David Hogg isn't the bully here. His powerful allies are. They built this culture. It's a culture of progressive corporate boardroom, the Progressive Academy, and all too many sectors of media and the arts. In this culture, Hogg is a weapon to wield so long as he's useful. He's the latest in a long line of victims and activists who spend their time as the face of an immense movement pushed forward by the media until that moment when the news cycle moves on, other victims emerge or other outrages inflame the masses. And, of course, he ends by talking about the fact that there would be great help if somebody could pull them aside and point out the fact that these particular victims activists are actually being used, I think we understand that, to advance their agenda. But more importantly, we will end up with competing victims on competing channels, but eventually they're going to have to face the cold, hard truth, and that is the vast majority of their new friends love them because they're useful, but if they deviate just 1 inch from the tribal lines, they'll quickly learn how scarce their true friends are. Teens are powerful only when they agree with powerful adults. This is an adult fight, and it has been from the beginning. But the point I'm making is kind of one that we talked about with Jay just a minute ago. It isn't that you're going to win the argument. In other words, I'm going to come up with a better argument. I'm going to come up with a more appropriate response. But instead, I'm just going to use any kind of economic power in this case, or political power, to punish our enemies. So the answer to bad speech is not better speech. The answer is the wielding of power. And it kind of brings us back to the conversation we had with Josh McDowell. We live in a world today where there's not right or wrong, truth or falsehood. It's just who has the power and who uses the power. And it is certainly relevant to a conversation we've had on this program before about civility. It's a conversation we'll have again next week. My commentary on Monday is talking about practicing civility. And, as a matter of fact, we're going to have in studio during our Truth Team Week an individual that has been kind of at the forefront of talking about civility, and that is Foster Freeze. He'll actually be in the studio for a short period of time while we're doing some of the fundraising that we always do, and he'll be helping us out in that regard. But also, of course, this idea of civility really is based upon the idea that we treat other people as we would like to be treated. It's called the Golden Rule. And if anything, I think the real test to civility is how you respond when someone who does not treat you in a civil manner. We recognize these high school students are going to say all sorts of things. High school students sometimes say things they later regret. Hey, adults say things they later regret. I don't know if they'll ever feel shame, because shame doesn't seem to be something we think about very much in America today. But certainly that's the case, and sometimes they're not always well informed. We understand that, and they certainly have a great deal of pain because they've been through a traumatic event, and so I expect some anger and emotion. What I don't expect is that then when somebody makes a mistake and responds in kind, the old fight fire with fire, or making the other side live up to its own rules, That isn't civility, number one. It doesn't work very well. And now it's led to a boycott of Laura Ingram's show. And as I think, as well pointed out by this piece by David French, it really isn't just an attack on Laura Ingram. It's an attack on the platform. Many of these individuals would actually just like to get rid of Fox News. So anytime they can take out someone or take out even a network, that's exactly what they're intending to do. So how do we respond when sometimes people are incivil? Well, I think that's where we recognize, again, everything from the golden rule to, let me put another verse on the table, and that would be Romans 12, verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And this, I think, is really a very important principle to follow in the midst of what have become very contentious debates. This debate is, of course, about gun control. The previous debate we just talked about is about immigration. Of course, we just talked with Jay about the debate about issues like gay rights or homosexuality. Whatever the issue is, we certainly have to understand that the other side and people that would disagree with you sometimes simply want to attack you. That's called an ad hominem attack. Certainly attack the man. And that's going to happen. And there's going to be people that want to marginalize you, people that want to vilify you. But I still think there is a value in trying to have a civil discourse and a civil discussion about these issues. And so one of the reasons why we post so many of these articles on Point of View is so you have some of the facts and figures and statistics. My one yesterday just on gun violence, very important, just to help you think through some of those important issues and to bring those facts and figures and statistics and data to the table. Well, that's all we have for today. Of course, tomorrow will be our Millennial Roundtable. I think you will always enjoy that conversation. And then later in the week, we, of course, have our roundtable at the end of the week, our weekend edition. And so we'll be talking about many of these very important issues. But again, I suspect over the next few days or weeks, immigration is going to be front and center, one, because of the caravan, and two, because of this citizenship question on the census. So if you'd like to read a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about today, they're all available at the website, pointofview.net. We certainly value your desire to get those pieces of information. We also value your financial support if you can help us out. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow at Point of View's Millennial Roundtable.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.